While the usual pre-games worries persist over doping demonstrations, overcrowding and security, Paris is preparing for a high-impact Games that takes the Olympic movement and its flagship event into new directions. Paris will create history just by adding water to its opening ceremony on the Seine River. Paris also follows London as only the second city to host the Summer Olympic Games on 3 occasions. And the IOC is also hoping that Paris can follow in London's footsteps and stage a grand Olympic spectacle that unites the world. Paris also marks the return of the world's biggest event back to Europe for the first time since those London Olympic Games 12 years ago. But this time it's a dramatically different Europe, at war and uncertain of its future. While Putin has refused to endorse the Olympic truce, the Olympic peace message will be amplified with greater urgency in a host nation of freedom fighters and defenders of liberty that epitomise the essence of the Olympic spirit. The IOC is hoping that the Olympic athletes can be symbols of hope in these turbulent times. And Paris has prepared a grand stage of spectacular venues in an electrifying city to take the world on a journey of hope from war to sport, as we discuss in this special iSportconnect Paris preview that follows. Welcome everyone for this countdown to Paris from wherever you're joining us around the world. I'm Michael Pirrie and I'm super excited to be joined today by some of the world's most experienced and knowledgeable experts on the Olympic Games for this countdown to Paris. We're joined today from the United States by Ed Hula. Ed is a recipient of the prestigious Pierre de Coubertin Award for his contribution and his services to the Olympic movement. We're also joined by Ric Birch from France. Ric has been a pioneer and development and director of some of the most memorable, iconic moments in the Olympic ceremonies, and he's helped to make the opening and closing ceremonies almost as important to the Games as the sport. Also joining us is Steve Wilson. Steve is one of the most highly regarded and respected sports commentators and editors, and he's covered just about every major sporting event you can imagine, from the World Cup to the Olympics to Wimbledon. Steve's sort of done it all. We're also joined by Taruka Srivastav, who's the content online director for iSportconnect, one of the world's leading sports business websites. So what we really want to do today is give you a bit of a background, a context for the Paris Olympic Games to help you understand the X factors, the critical success factors that go into the making of the Olympic Games as the world's pinnacle sporting experience. The Seine River opening ceremony will be the biggest aquatic event in Europe since the Queen's Jubilee celebrations in 2012 in London, where we had about more than 600 boats on the River Thames and 1 million spectators lining the banks of the river. Of course, the Paris Games it marks the return of the Summer Games to Europe for the first time since London, but it's a very different Europe. And I'm just wondering, Ric, with all the divisions through war and the rise of the extreme far right across the continent, is this an opportunity for the opening ceremony to try and bring the continent and the world together? Can it do that?
Well, as you know, we're forbidden to have political signs, slogans, or any symbols within a ceremony. So the chance of doing a negative political impact, I've got no idea. I think the Olympics, although it tries not to be too political, it it isn't it isn't political. It should be a snapshot of the host nation and the host capital. And if that all goes well, and certainly the images will be of Paris. Hopefully, it'll be a great day. Everything will look fabulous. That transcends politics. The story is going to be: this is Paris, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, bringing the world's best athletes together to compete. I mean, it's a very good story. I wouldn't imagine that politics will come into it unless the TV commentators choose to. It really would be out of place to introduce it unless there is something that happens on the river itself.
Well, I guess the role of the ceremony is to really introduce the history and the culture of the host city and nation. And there's probably no better way than to do that for Paris and going down the Seine River, close down to the Eiffel Tower and all the great history and of that part of the city. So, I mean, that will be a stunning introduction to the games.
One logistical note I would add here: there won't be 200 boats. Some NOCs, some countries will have to share boats.
Well, great games inevitably seem to involve great humanity, and I think we'll probably see that in Paris through the journey and the storylines of the Ukrainian Olympic team, given the hardships and what they've had to overcome with the war in their country just to get to the Olympics and to be part of the global community in Paris. What do you think, Steve?
Yes, for sure. One of the emotional strong points of these games will be the appearance of the Ukrainian athletes in many different sports, and a lot of them endured quite hardships just to get there. And we'll hear a lot of powerful stories about their families back home, how they're watching, how they're unable to watch, how the war has affected them directly and their families. This will be a constant storyline through the games, as well as, what about Russia and how will they come across in these games? As you know, there will be there'll be a small contingent of Russian athletes competing as individual neutral athletes without any Russian symbols at all this time. But we'll still, there'll still be maybe some awkward moments, to put it at least, when a Ukrainian athlete may face an athlete who is Russian by birth, and how that will play out could also be, quite interesting stories developing through the games. So yes, Ukraine will be the entire Ukraine story of the athletes, of the impact of the war on them, and how they can compete against any athletes from Russia will be closely watched throughout the games, I think.
And meanwhile, while the so-called neutral athletes from Russia are competing, less than 3 flying hours away in Ukraine, there'll be, fellow countrymen involved in mass murder operations against the Ukraine citizens. I mean, it seems a extraordinary juxtaposition of what will be happening in Europe during these games.
Yes, it's we've known this is going to be the case, and I think we'll hear a lot more stories about how these games are taking place with war on the doors on Europe going on at the same time. The idea of having the Olympic truce during the games is a great one, and I'm sure we'll hear about the Olympic truce, and the UN would be pushing for an Olympic truce to be observed. But it really seems hard to imagine that we could see an end or a pause to the war going on in Ukraine during the games at this point, let alone perhaps in Israel and Hamas. We'll see how that situation develops during the games as well. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that and the impact that it has on some of the athletes competing in Paris too.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how that all plays out, Steve. Especially you've got, you'll have the Ukrainian president there, Zelensky. You've had reports recently that Russia is trying to sabotage the games with cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, things like that. But despite all that going on, the French and the Paris community and organisers have done an incredible job to keep all the planning and the organisation on track. Everything seems to be in good shape. They've got the venues are all ticking over. The test events have gone well. So despite any attempts by Putin, who is said to be is furious about not being able to have the Russian athletes fully recognised at the games, that in itself is a great success story for Paris, that they've been able to overcome all these barriers.
That's right. We'll probably hear more stories about that during the games. There may be more attempts to, disinformation campaigns and hacking campaigns. There's a big effort by the French authorities and others to stop any hacking efforts that will likely be taking place.
The other thing about these games, that's interesting, is that it's very important, obviously, for Paris. Great games require great leadership, and although there's been some the elections, Macron's been scrambling to, save the country from the far right. He and the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, although they've had their political differences, they seem very committed, and they've put in significant resources and efforts to keep the Paris Games on track. They obviously see it as very important. They were both involved from the outset in the appointment of Paris as the host city for 2024. Macron, a bit like his British counterpart, Tony Blair, sees the Games as very much part of his legacy. So they've also got the political leadership, and they've got the political unity there between the city and the national governments to help keep these games, on track over the next few weeks, and that all the fears they had about the recent elections haven't impacted on the planning for the games at all so far.
The timing of the elections in Paris was not ideal for the Olympic Games, coming so shortly before the opening. You're right. I mean, the elections the result could have been much different and much more worrisome. But the fact there is still a lot of political uncertainty in France. The new government still hasn't been formed yet. We may find out that may happen just before the games start. We're not quite sure. But it does add an element of political uncertainty to the entire situation. But you're right. I mean, these games are important on the national level for the entire country, for Macron, and for the government itself. So I think we'll see a rallying around of most of the political forces behind the games. But it is still an uncertain period, and very unusual to be in this situation just before the start of the games.
In many ways, the Paris Games is been very similar to the London in terms of the layout of the venues. You've got all these iconic venues in the city being used. But the big difference, I think, is the fact that, unlike London, all Paris's venues are almost all existing or temporary pop-up venues. You haven't got an Olympic park, which traditionally has been a big cost factor in staging the games, the co-location of new venues around a single site. That's been avoided, and that, as a result, has helped to lower the costs and make these a much more affordable games. And that means these games are very important as a test event for Thomas Bach's Agenda 2020 Games model. How do you see that as playing out, Ed?
Well, it is part of the direction the IOC is trying to take to make the games less complicated, simplified, lower the costs, because they've simply run out of places that are willing to just spend as much as needs to be spent to host an Olympic Games. I think these are the first ones to be held totally under Thomas Bach's Olympic Agenda 2025. And I think it's a direction we're going to see the games take over the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, it seems as though the games now are being positioned with the dramatically lower cost of Paris and the French Games because of the reliance on existing and temporary venues.
But we're still talking about $9 billion.
Yeah,
That's the budget for Paris.
Yeah,
And
it's still a significant sum of money. The investment in that is that they're getting a brand new athletes' village in a deprived part of outside of Paris in Saint Denis, so that will be turned into affordable housing as well as a mix of affordable and private housing. After the games, that will help to regenerate that area. Again, we saw that model used in the Olympic Park in London, in one of the poorest parts of Europe, where the park helped to regenerate, created more schools, commercial space, parkland, etc. Biggest new park in Europe in 100 years. So that's an example there where the games can actually fast forward the long-term development of a city in a much shorter time than it would normally take. But these all things have to be weighed out. So it looks as though the IOC is now looking for a more flexible approach to legacy, saying that the legacy might be economical, in this case for Paris. So it looks as though this new approach, Steve, Ed, Taruka and Ed, is one that will hopefully avoid the so-called white elephant syndrome that has burdened the Olympic, the costs of the Olympic Games for many years now. Often that has not been due to the IOC and its allocation process. Often the governments that have been awarded the Games have not kept to the promises that they made when bidding for the Games. So the IOC is now entering into a much more of a cooperative joint venture with the host cities, and is, I think, shown that it might be able to better control the costs of the Games by getting involved at a much earlier stage in the bidding of the Games, rather than having to try and deal with governments that might change after winning the Games, and governments that might decide they want to make another statement about the Games that's different to the one in which they were seeking to stage the Games in the first place.
The IOC is taking a greater control over the Games. More IOC staff than ever are involved in the planning, the preparation. So it's going to become very hard for bid cities, host cities, to deviate, to try a different thing that the IOC doesn't like, because the IOC is now watching really closely every step of the Games.
And just to add to that, I mean, from now on, the IOC also has a new policy for selecting the Games, the hosts. So they're in there from the beginning. They're not going to accept bids that don't fit the model anymore. They're no longer going to be wide open races from people trying to outdo each other. The IOC is in there from the beginning with their future host commissions, dialoguing with potential host cities, and deciding really where they want to go, and is this a good fit, and do the two mesh together? So you shouldn't no longer have a situation in which you have a host city promising these, to build all these great castles and for spending billions of dollars. That's not going to happen anymore. The IOC is going to make sure from day one that the bid and the possible host city is doing it within the scope of these new reforms, which are now being implemented for the first time overall in Paris. So it's a big test case.
Yeah, it is a big test case, Steve. Paris is obviously making available all its great cultural and historic history for these Games, but all the masterpieces won't necessarily be confined to the Louvre during the Games. We're going to have some of the best athletes of the generation competing in Paris, some for the last time, Simone Biles, others. How do you see all that? The other, especially in relation to the other critical success factors for the Games, seems to be that all the Games that have done really well have had teams. The host nation team has performed really well on the medal table. The virtual medal table predicted for Paris has the French team in a very high place, its highest place on the medal table for many decades. So that also is a good sign for the Games ahead.
The French are hoping to win maybe 50 medals. 43 is the record so far for them, and the largest team ever that they've sent to the Games, nearly 600 athletes. So they'll be shooting for setting a record here for sure.
Yeah, the pressure's on. The pressure's on. Even Macron has made a point of telling the French athletes, we need to see some gold medals here. This is our home games. Let's show them how it's done. And I think in Tokyo, I believe French won 33 medals. I think Ed, you're right. I think they're projected as many as 56 this time around, which would be quite a boost, and maybe close to even 29, 30 gold medals. That would be quite a performance by the French home team, and it would obviously help boost even further the popularity, viewership, atmosphere of the games in Paris and the rest of the country. So, yeah, I think the performance of the French team will be a big thing to watch.
And Steve, obviously, if that team does well, that in itself could be a critical factor for helping to unite and bring the country together in these very difficult political times.
Of course, it always is. Countries always rally around their athletes at the Olympic Games. It's a big point of national pride, and we'll see that on a huge scale, I'm sure, in Paris.
Other notable things about the Games ahead will be the IOC's drive for parity between the male and female athletes. For the first time, there'll be, I think, more female athletes competing. What do you think about that, Taruka? How do you see that playing out?
I think it's wonderful because I have been an athlete myself. I participated in the Asian Games 2010. And, I now that we're going to the Olympics, I think it's a very big deal. It will be like 50% men and 50% women. And there could be nothing better than this. And not just this, there's so many other initiatives being taken. For example, having a nursery built. I think it's Alison Parker who suggested it, and it was noted by the LOC, and they're creating that. And not just with gender parity, and creating nursery and making it more important for women. Apart from this, even sustainability wise, they've taken like big steps, but obviously we'll come to know later post the games how well it did. But with regards to gender parity, I think they're going to make a brilliant statement, and I think a very much needed statement as well. So it's terrific.
Any other thoughts there about the Paris Games that you think would be relevant for people tuning into this podcast?
Well, just listening to Steve, particularly talking about the Ukrainian war continuing and Gaza at the same time as the Games, that in the end, of course, is going to be up to the journalists. The coverage of the sport will be reflected in the occasional brushes of Russian athletes up against Ukrainians. But funnily enough, in the past, whenever we've had to put athletes together on the field of play, as you know, it's in alphabetical order. And back in the day, when Iran and Iraq were at war, alphabetically, their athletes were side by side. And ironically enough, we ended up putting Ireland between Iran and Iraq just to separate them on the field. I don't think that's going to be necessary if they're in boats. So perhaps that was part of the thinking behind it. I'm very excited. I'm living in France at the moment, so I'm very excited at the thought that the Olympics will be taking place here. But I'm not going to go to Paris. I'll watch it on television. I think that's going to be the best place to watch it.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of talk also in the last few days and few months as well about the security there. The security aspect of the Games is probably the most important aspect of any Games now. Do you think that will be the challenge there is to make sure that these are the Games, the security, these aren't security games, but they are still sporting games. Do you see that as being a concern at this stage?
Well, we've talked about the opening ceremony a lot today, and perhaps the biggest concern is about security for the opening ceremony, because for obvious reasons, this is unprecedented to have an opening ceremony like this with 10,000 athletes on boats going down the river and thousands of people on the banks watching them. How do you secure such an event? It's hard to imagine how you can do it, but so I'd say if there's one concern about the Olympic Games right now in Paris, it's the security for the opening ceremony. we've heard all along that they've made great plans for this. They're going to be shutting down the airspace. The airports will be closed. There'll be untold numbers of security forces on the ground. So fingers crossed it'll go well, and I think it will. But will be a concern till the very last moment to make sure that everything gets done safely and securely, and we hope that's the case. And I guess one other sort of storyline which keeps coming around is the Seine River, and whether the Seine is not only hosting the Olympic ceremony, but it's also going to host some events in which swimming is involved in the Seine, with the triathlon event and the open water swimming events. So we've heard a lot about the quality of the river. We know Paris and France has made a huge effort to clean up the river, to make it swimmable again after all these years. And we've heard that at the moment it's swimmable. There have actually been the sports minister from France swam in it the other day. But the river quality of the river can change at any time, especially if there's a lot of rain. So we're just hoping that the river will be clean and that athletes will be actually to swim in the River Seine during the Olympics. So that'll be another event to watch with a lot of anticipation, I think.
Just to add to that, I read this morning that the president himself is going to take a dive and prove it to everyone that, we've managed to put in more than $1 billion and clean it. So let's see. Good point, Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and just finally, I mean, when we look at the X factors for games, it's the venues, because the games take place in venues, and you really couldn't get a more spectacular setup of venues that Paris has got. As I said, it's following in the footsteps of London. Instead of Wimbledon, you've got Roland Garros. Instead of Wembley, you've got Stade de France. Instead of Horse Guards Parade, you've got other iconic Paris settings. So it's they will help to showcase the sport like rarely before. So I mean that in itself, I think all the planning's there. The test events have gone well. They've got these iconic venues. That will translate into an amazing spectator and viewership spectacle around the world. So you've got some of these very important parts of how a games unfolds that will get attention, I think, when the games start. But at the moment, as happens with all games, there are always issues that tend to overshadow them in the build-up. It's just part of the landscape now for the Olympics. So how do you see all that, guys?
Well, I see these games as these games, don't forget, are the first post-COVID games we've had. We haven't had a really fully fledged successful games, I would say, since London. So this is a big moment for the Olympic movement, for the IOC in particular, to come back to Paris. No COVID, no organizational problems, beautiful city, incredible venues, huge potential audiences on television. This is what IOC has been waiting for a long time, to get back to the games that the world wants to see. So I think all the elements are in place for the games to return really to their premier status in the world. And we'll find out soon enough, but I think everything is in place for that to happen.
Yeah, they're in a good spot. It would take something catastrophic to really throw them off the rails right now. They seem to have, the last minute glitches like the elections a few weeks ago will not have a serious impact on the games. At least they didn't change governments, as was the case in, Rio 8 years ago, where the government changed literally on the eve of the games while they were impeaching the country's president. So there's been a lot of stability that's gone into preparing these games, and it would take something really extraordinary to throw the attention away from what's been done to get ready in Paris.
living in France, Rick, how do you see the French flair and the French culture playing into these games?
Well, I have to say, I'm living down the south of France in an agricultural kind of area in a small village, and the locals were very excited by the Tour de France because it came rushing through Montflanquin, which is where I am. And I stood there for 4 hours, and the cyclist went through in 15 seconds. It's the most anticlimactic thing I've ever seen. So the Olympic ceremonies are a lot more value for money, and I'm looking forward to them. No, look, the French flair, the creativity, and the special joie de vivre that the French bring to everything. I'm sure the Olympics will be fantastic. The design element will be wonderful. And, I think in the normal, delightful way, the Parisians grumble and complain. But like every Olympic city in the past where people complain and grumble, when the games come to town, suddenly the lights come on, the sun shines all the time, and everyone has a great time. And I think the chance for Paris, as Steve said, to help the games recover from the COVID period, I think it's probably one of the best cities in the world to do that. And I'm really, really hoping it goes perfectly for them.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone's hoping, and we're running out of time, and time's obviously counting down now to Paris. So I want to thank you all for joining in this conversation today and for sharing your thoughts and insights. They're much appreciated. And I hope this has given the viewers a bit of a background and context for understanding the games that are coming, the long-anticipated games to Paris, more than, 100 years in the making since they were last there. They're going to, on behalf of everyone, I think, in the whole world, we're behind Paris and France, and looking forward to them staging, the games that will live long in the world's memory of great sporting events and cultural events. And also, I think they will unite the world. The world will unite around Paris, I think, and the job it's had to do, the many sort of challenges that they've had to face, the fact that they're giving their very best, they're opening their city and their country up to the world. They'll be welcoming the world with a great sense of pride and hospitality. The French are a very, very hospitable people, and I think they have a great love of sport. And let's also remember that the Olympic Games are coming home to the nation of the great Pierre de Coubertin, who reimagined the Games for the world. And Paris are now hosting his Games on his behalf again, in many ways through his eyes, with the same hopes and visions that he had for the Games, as a opportunity to try and build bridges and create dialogues and understandings and peace. That is probably needed more now than in many previous games.
Yes, Michael, you're right. I mean, Paris is some kind of coming home for the IOC. That's where they're born. The games were born, the recovery of the games in the IOC. So they're back for the third time. And the world is in a troubled place right now. And the IOC sees these games as being, a potential way to bring the world together in a peaceful competition, as Duc de Coubertin had invented. And this is the moment where, hopefully the world will tune in and feel good about it, without forgetting that there are wars going on, and these will be reflected in some ways in Paris by those who are competing from those countries. But this is a big moment for the Olympic movement. It's returning to the Paris after all these years, after COVID's finished, everything's in place, and I think we're in for a spectacular 3 weeks.
Okay. Well, everyone, look, thank you so much for all your insights. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts and outlining all the many different strands that go towards the staging of an Olympic Games, especially one that's going to be so rich in its culture and its its vision as Paris. So we hope and look forward to seeing everyone in Paris. If you're going there, please enjoy the games, and if not, enjoy the experience on TV and on digital media and socials. It'll be everywhere. It'll be the world will be will be totally united around this event, and we'll be following it, I think, very closely for the next few weeks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.